All right. We are live right here on X, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Rumble. Welcome to the Liz Wheeler Show. Thank you to everyone who's been subscribing over on Spotify. I greatly appreciate it. If you would, before we launch into today's show, if you'd open up your phone, open up your Spotify app, search for the Liz Wheeler Show, hit that subscribe button, and leave us a 5-star review. I would greatly appreciate it. It helps other people find the show when you leave reviews and our rating goes up. And I'm really excited to see all the new listeners and viewers over on Spotify as well. It's possible that that it came back live and that it didn't just cut out because it said 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So do you want to check to see if we are live or not? I think we are. Maybe the topic of the show. Okay, guys, can you hear me? We're having some technical difficulties. We're not exactly sure where the technical difficulties are coming from. So if you can hear me and you can see me, let me know, both audio and video, that it's good. All right. Sierra says good afternoon. Mike says you're back. Brenda says I see you. Sierra says I hear you. Okay. Okay. Yep. It looks like we are back. I'm not exactly sure what that technical difficulty is, but I will tell you, we have quite the topic for today's show. I believe I was in the middle of thanking you for subscribing on Spotify. I appreciate everybody who's done that. If you haven't subscribed to the show on Spotify, please do. I'm delighted to see all of the new faces over there, listeners and viewers. We, of course, have video over on Spotify. And it is an uncensored platform. So if you're ever looking for the absolute full content of the show, Spotify is a great place to find it. We don't have to tiptoe around terms of service like we do on Facebook or on YouTube sometimes. So appreciate everybody subscribing over there. Thank you for doing so. The topic of today's show, as you can tell from the title of the show, is a warning. Today, it gives me no pleasure to start the show like this, but I need to warn you about something that's about to happen. Something that's about to happen today, actually just in a matter of hours. We're about T-minus 2 hours, 2 hours and 3 minutes until this violence is scheduled to be unleashed on our nation. And when I say violence, it's not just vague violence. It's not just criminal activities. Left-wing terrorism is about to be unleashed in some of our biggest cities here in the United States, specifically at 4 p.m. Eastern. It seems weird, funny to be able to pinpoint exactly what time and in exactly what location these left-wing terror activities are slated to take place. But the thing is, they told us when these violent activities are scheduled to take place. They created a flyer and they passed it around because they wanted their ideological cohorts to show up and to take part in these violent riots. So they told us, they warned us exactly what is about to happen. We are about to be subject to violence. And I'm talking about Black Lives Matter riot style violence, burning of buildings, arson, attacks on cops, looting. I'm talking about anti-ICE style riots, the stuff we saw out in Los Angeles just a couple of weeks ago, where these not grassroots, not organic rioters dressed in pro-Hamas keffiyehs set fire, poured gasoline on car engines, set those cars on fire, blocked highways, broke windows on police precincts. I'm talking about Antifa style deliberate law breaking and disruption, left-wing terrorism. I'm talking about the pro-Hamas style agitation that we saw on college campuses that inevitably, intentionally descended into altercation with both Jewish students and with police. That is what is about to be unleashed on cities right here in the United States, and it is scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern. How do I know that this is about to happen? Well, I know this is about to happen because of the group that is organizing this left-wing violence. They have created a graphic that's a de facto invitation for like-minded left-wing terrorists to participate in this. And I'm going to show you that advertisement, and I'm going to show you what group is behind these riots that are about to happen, the individual who founded this group, and of course, where they're funding their resources, how it's possible for them to organize such events, where that's coming from. Today's episode is proudly sponsored by Cozy Earth. Listen, I have Cozy Earth products all over my home because I love them. I have their pajamas in lavender. I have their bed sheets, which are super soft. Love them because they're temperature regulating. I have them in white. I have their bath towels. They have bath sheets and bath towels, hand towels, and washcloths. I have them all in this lovely gray shade. I have their fluffy bubble blanket on my couch in my living room right now. My kids absolutely love to make little nests in it. Their sheets, like I said, they're temperature regulating because they're made of bamboo. They're viscose sheets. So whether you sleep warm or whether you sleep cool, they regulate your sheet or your sleep. They naturally wick away any heat and moisture, which is lovely. Their bubble cuddle blanket brings this layer of luxury to your room. I actually like not just to use it as a blanket, I like the texture it provides for the aesthetic of my living room. Their bedding and their loungewear. Oh, by the way, I also have their t-shirt. I wear their t-shirt on the show sometimes. I should point that out the next time I have it on. And their lounge pants. Their stuff is great. I'm obsessed with it. So, highly recommend that you dive in and get some Cozy Earth stuff yourself, or buy some Cozy Earth stuff for your family and your friends. Head to cozyearth.com. If you use my code Liz at checkout, you can get up to 20% off. And if you get a post-purchase survey, make sure to let them know that you heard about Cozy Earth right here, because Liz loves Cozy Earth. I'm literally obsessed with their stuff. That's cozyearth.com, code Liz, because your home isn't just where you live, it's how you feel. Let's go home with Cozy Earth. Cozyearth.com, code Liz. So the left-wing violence that is scheduled for today at 4 p.m., it sounds so weird to say that, like a doctor's appointment or a play date at the park. Riots, be there at 4 p.m. in major cities across the country, New York, Chicago, North Carolina. We are expecting left-wing terrorism in T-minus 2 hours. And the reason for that is because today is the 2-year anniversary of the October 7th terror attacks that Hamas waged on innocent Israelis, Jews, and Americans in Israel. That happened 2 years ago today. And of course, the moral framework of the situation between Israel and Hamas, that is unchanged. Hamas terrorists, Islamic terrorists, committed heinous acts against innocent civilians in Israel, and Israel has every right to defend her people and to exist. So the moral framework is the same. The practical issues 2 years later, those you, of course, can question anything you want. I mean, you and I think, share a worldview that we don't want the U.S. dragged into a forever war. It seems that the politicians in charge of Israel have a little more neocon tendencies than you and I do, and it's fair for us to question how much U.S. aid is being given to Israel because of our difference in that particular foreign policy or war philosophy. We can also question, Israeli war strategy. Did you intentionally or negligently bomb that Catholic church? It's, of course, as I mentioned on the episode where we talked about Israel and Palestine and Hamas last week, it's a little bit difficult to tell what's true and what's not because it's a big fog of propaganda from all sides. And then, of course, we have the pro-Israel lobby here in the United States who has behaved poorly, especially towards people who dare to have any questions about Israel's government. A lot has changed. A lot has changed in the course of the past 2 years since that Hamas attack on Israel. Young people in our country are largely anti-Israel at this point, probably because of the unfortunately, successful propaganda of Hamas, and perhaps because Israel has not respected the fact that American citizens are going to be America first, even if we understand the importance of an ally like Israel. The reason that I bring this up is because today is the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, and these riots that we expect to be unleashed on our cities today, the left-wing riots that we expect to be unleashed in Chicago and New York City and in North Carolina at 4 p.m. Eastern on the dot, are scheduled today because today is the anniversary of October 7th of that terror attack. And the group that organized these, they of course call them protests. We know that when the left calls their events protests, it is not a protest. A protest is inherently peaceful. It is people independently as a group coming together organically to raise their voices against a grievance that they feel, and they're asking their government for a recourse of that grievance. That's not what left-wing protests are right now. We know that because we saw the Black Lives Matter riots, we saw the anti-ICE riots, we saw the pro-Hamas riots on college campuses. That is what we expect today. The group behind these planned protests is a group called Behind Enemy Lines. Behind Enemy Lines. And this is the target list that they released in anticipation of their planned protests today. We can show this on the screen. This is the list. And this is a specific target list for the New York City protests. They have released a target list for each of the cities where these protests are planned. like I said, big cities across the country, particularly Chicago and New York, because Behind Enemy Lines, this group, it originates in Chicago. We'll get to the person who founded this group and why the tie to Chicago is important. But as you can see, they have specific targets where they are going to protest. And these are both targets related to the US government, targets related to the Israeli government. They are private businesses who do business in some way with Israel. They are defense contractors. They are politicians and the families and the businesses of politicians who are pro-Israel politicians. And believe it or not, the targets on these lists are not just Republican targets. They also include some Democrat apparatuses or institutions who are viewed by this radical group Behind Enemy Lines to be too pro-Israel. Now, you might wonder why a group like this would telegraph that they are having a protest or that they are planning violence before it happens. But here's the thing. If you are adequately infiltrated into the sphere of these groups, whether it's Antifa, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's, niche groups like Behind Enemy Lines, whether it's the Party of Socialism and Liberation, which was behind the anti-ICE riots out in Los Angeles a couple months ago, then you know that these flyers are how the groups, which are technically disconnected, connect with each other. It's how they coordinate. It's how they always have all of their members show up at the various events that are planned. The flyer, as you can see, says, quote, "No business as usual, escalate for Gaza." So anybody wondering, well, how do you know this is going to be violent? How do you know this isn't going to be a peaceful protest? Well, it's because they say so themselves, but also because of what this group stands for and the person behind this group. So this group itself, what is their ideology? Behind Enemy Lines describes itself as a group that operates in, quote, the belly of the beast. Now, what does that mean? Well, the belly of the beast, they mean they operate in the United States. They are calling the United States the beast. They say they are operating from within, and yet they are against, quote unquote, U.S. imperialism. They don't want the U.S. to be associated with Israel in any way, shape, or form. And instead of acting like normal people, law-abiding people, citizens of a country, they are using terror tactics to bring attention to their marginal political ideology. And when I say that, this is quite literally the definition of domestic terrorism, if you look in a political science textbook, is to commit an act of violence in order to bring more eyeballs through the coverage of the violence you've committed to your political ideology. So when this group, Behind Enemy Lines, that describes themselves as operating within the belly of the beast, when they use the word disruption to describe their modus operandi, they use disruption to bring attention to their political ideology. That is inherently a domestic terrorist tactic. And law enforcement around the country, by the way, recognizes Behind Enemy Lines as a militant group because that's what they are. They are radical and violent in their beliefs. The leadership of Behind Enemy Lines has praised the Hamas attacks, called the Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th, 2 years ago today. The leadership of Behind Enemy Lines called October 7th, quote, a righteous act of Palestinian resistance that shattered a murderous status quo. The leadership of Behind Enemy Lines has called for people in the United States to, quote, resist U.S. imperialism, has called for the destruction of Israel and of businesses or people who do business with Israel. This is not a peaceful group. This is not a group that just wants to bring attention to their chosen cause. This is a group that has a violent ideology and has demonstrated their willingness to commit violence in the name of their ideology. The leadership of Behind Enemy Lines also described October 7th as Hamas righteously broke through the apartheid wall and took the fight to their enemies. This is innocent concert goers who were brutally raped and murdered by terrorists who live streamed the murder of grandmothers and then called their family members and cried in joy about committing these murders. This is evil in the flesh. And yet the leadership of Behind Enemy Lines is praising this as the right thing to do. The history of the group Behind Enemy Lines is a violent history. They have a history of physical altercations with law enforcement. By the way, This is a somewhat new group. Their origin is in Chicago, as I mentioned earlier, but they only came into being in the last couple of years, in 2023 or maybe a year or two before that. The idea was planted in the mind of the co-founder of this group. But this is a relatively new group, which we'll get into this a little bit later in the show. This is exactly how the leftist ecosphere works. They have a whole bunch of sort of vaguely named groups, and these groups operate like shell groups to hide both the militant operatives, but also the resources and the funding that goes into these not grassroots, not organic, planned riots that we have seen so often in the last year in our country. Behind Enemy Lines, in their brief 2 to 3 years of operation, already has a history, a documented history of engaging in violent tactics. They've engaged in physical altercations after crashing a DNC event. As I said, they don't just target Republicans, they target anyone who they believe is in too close of a relationship with Israel. And when I say too close of a relationship with Israel, if you believe Israel has a right to exist, or you even do business with another business that does business with Israel, in the minds of Behind Enemy Lines, that's too close of a relationship with Israel, and you don't deserve to be to live in peace. They don't want you to know any peace, is the words of their founder, which we'll get to in a moment. The violent history of Behind Enemy Lines also includes dozens and dozens of arrests by Chicago police, because one of their favorite tactics is engaging in unpermitted rallies. In this case, outside of an Israeli consulate. You're not allowed to do that. And they deliberately do this to taunt police in order to be arrested. They want to be arrested in order to bring attention to their marginal cause. So when I say that this group is relatively new, when I say it's been operating for 2 or maybe 3 years, that its origin is in Chicago, who is behind this group? Well, what's interesting about what these left-wing groups do is sometimes they don't have a formal business structure for their group because they don't want to disclose who's funding it. They want everything to be as obscure, as opaque, as obfuscated as possible. And that's exactly the case for this particular group, Behind Enemy Lines. We do know who the founder of this group is. It's a relatively young man by the name of Michael Boit. Michael Boit, and when I say relatively young, he's 40 years old, which by standards comparing him to politicians in our country, he's a very young man. Compared to Gen Z, he is, of course, not. But it's critical, I think, to note his age because he's a millennial and he looks like a millennial. When you see him in this video that I'm about to show you, this is from a video conference in December of 2023. He's talking about his particular group. He's talking about BEL, Behind Enemy Lines, and he's talking about the tactics that they use to disrupt American life and to make sure that those who support Israel, quote, know no peace. Take a look at the founder of Behind Enemy Lines. This is Michael Boit.
We have a responsibility to act in even greater numbers and with greater seriousness and discipline and fortitude here in the US, the country that's behind so much of this horror that's raining down on the people of Gaza. And the people who are behind this, the politicians, the weapons manufacturers, the complicit institutions, should be met with protest and resistance, and really should know peace, should know no peace. So in Behind Enemy Lines, we've been trying to do agitation and exposure against one of these ruling class families that's based here in Chicago, the Crown family. They're the principal shareholders of General Dynamics, the 5th largest weapons contractors in the world. And they sell MK Mark 84 bombs to the IDF as a principal staple of the death and destruction that's been rained down on the people of Gaza. So we've been trying to expose and resist the institutions that are tied in with that.
Okay, so Spence, can we bring the screenshot of that back up on the screen? Because there's a couple of things just visually that we should note about Michael Boit, the founder of Behind Enemy Lines, the group that is planning for protests, violent protests here in the United States at 4 p.m. Eastern today. So if you'll notice, and this is a group, by the way, of the entire Zoom call. The other participants on the Zoom call are also on the screen here. But let's talk about Michael Boit for a second. What do we notice about him when we look at him? First of all, we notice that he has around his neck the keffiyeh, the pro-Hamas neckerchief. That means that he's not just worried about Palestinian children being civilian casualties of the war between Israel and Hamas. That means he's not just worried about whether food is being adequately transported into the Palestinian territories. That means that Michael Boyd, this neckerchief indicates that Michael Boyd is sympathetic to Hamas. Hamas is a radical Islamist terror organization designated so by the United States government, and they live up to their name. They commit heinous acts of violence against Jews because they're Jews. American citizens were among the victims on October 7th, and yet Michael Boyd proudly wears their insignia. This is the same as Che Guevara wearing the communist insignia. This is a marker to the world of his ideology, and he verbally, by the way, also clues you into what his ideology is. What was that phrase that he used? Ruling class. He wants to provide disruption against the ruling class. Well, what's another way of describing disruption against the ruling class? Another way of describing that would be the Marxist vanguard for the communist revolution. That's the ideology of Michael Boyd. And you'll notice, too, his physical appearance. He's pudgy with prosperity. It's always the people that you most expect. It's the upper middle class, white leftists who probably went to rich schools, whose parents probably have a lot of money, who now hate America, which gave them every opportunity in the world. But unfortunately, they were indoctrinated either by their parents and their parental ideology or by the school system that they were put through. That's visually what we observe here about Michael Boyd. He claims that he was inspired to found Behind Enemy Lines by the 1968 anti-war protests, which is also telling because those protests were very violent. And he founded Behind Enemy Lines amid the Black Lives Matter protests, which, again, were protests not about racial justice or racial equality or police brutality, but were protests in the name of critical race theory, falsely accusing the United States of being a racist country and all white people of being racist just by nature of having white skin, organized by literal trained Marxists. And when I say that, I'm not just describing their behavior and their ideology. That's their words. The founder of the Black Lives Matter movement herself said, "We are trained Marxists." So this is the individual behind the riots that are scheduled for 4 p.m. Eastern today. So we know the group Behind Enemy Lines. We've now established the individual who has organized this group. He founded this group. He is dedicated to this group. But in order to be fully dedicated to this kind of action, I won't call it activism because it's not that innocent. In order to dedicate your life and all your time to this, you have to be making money somehow. You have to pay your own bills. You have to have some kind of source of funding for operational costs. How do you make these flyers? How do you actually get people to the protest sites? This type of stuff takes coordination. Every event planner in the world knows that this is not done. This is not just happen. This is not something that happens for free. Where is the money coming from? Well, the answer to that question can be found through an examination of who Michael Boyd associates himself with. And we're going to come back, by the way, take a good look at this graphic on the screen. The other participants in this group chat or this Zoom call, we're going to come back to this graphic in a minute because the man in the top, circled right now in green, the one whose face and head is covered again in that pro-Hamas terrorist keffiyeh, that individual is someone who is extremely important in describing where the money for Michael Boyd's violent riots comes from. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But the question that I want to answer first is, who does Michael Boyd most often coordinate with? Who does he, to use a Gen Z term that has gone mainstream, who does he collab with most often? Well, the answer to that is 3 organizations. The answer to that is Michael Boyd and his organization Behind Enemy Lines most often collaborates with a group called the Answer Coalition. We'll get into who the Answer Coalition is in a moment. If you are a longtime viewer of this show, that may ring a bell for you. If not, we'll get into it in just a moment. The second group that Michael Boyd and Behind Enemy Lines constantly collabs with is Students for Justice in Palestine. Again, we'll get into that group in a moment. And the third group that is a frequent collaborator with Michael Boyd and Behind Enemy Lines is a group called the Palestinian Youth Movement. These 3 organizations, the Answer Coalition, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Palestinian Youth Movement basically tell you everything you need to know about Michael Boyt, about his group behind enemy lines, and perhaps most importantly, because there's actually something we can do about this, where the funding for his operation is coming from. So let's walk through this bit by bit. When I say that Michael Boyt and Behind Enemy Lines constantly collaborates with the Answer Coalition, what do I mean? Well, let me give you an example. In 2023, Michael Boyt hosted a summit, a gathering called the Chicago Area Peace Action Summit. They always have very ambiguous names because they don't want to say, this is the Marxist Revolution Violent Training Camp, because then that would draw attention from law enforcement and you would think, at least from some media outlets. Well, in 2023, at the Chicago Area Peace Action Summit, which was led by Michael Boyt, who was the co-leader of this event, who was right there on stage with Michael Boyt, but the Answer Coalition. The Answer Coalition. Now, the Answer Coalition claims to be anti-war and anti-imperialist, et cetera, but truthfully, they are a Marxist-Leninist operation by their own description. Again, I'm not inferring their ideology. They are self-admitted Marxists. And on stage next to Michael Boyt, at his invitation, collaborating with him, were representatives from the Answer Coalition talking about U.S. foreign policy and resistance to U.S. foreign policy. Now, they also, on the Answer Coalition's website and on Behind Enemy Lines website and their social media, they jointly advertised this joint event together. Again, I cannot emphasize strongly enough the integration between the Answer Coalition and Behind Enemy Lines. It's not that one event either. There are additional events. In August of 2024, that's just a little bit over 1 year ago, at the DNC in Chicago, Illinois, this is before the presidential election, you might remember that there was protests outside of the DNC, but it wasn't protests from Republicans. It wasn't protests from the right or from Trump supporters. It was far leftist protesters who were anti-DNC. They were against Joe Biden, and we weren't exactly sure where they stood on Kamala Harris. But the organizers of that march on the DNC that happened in August of 2024 was Behind Enemy Lines and the Answer Coalition. These two groups were part, yes, there were other groups that were involved, but the leaders of this group were Behind Enemy Lines and Answer Coalition, in addition to the other groups I mentioned, Students for Justice in Palestine and the Palestinian Youth Movement. Now, this march against the DNC is a good example of the tactics that Behind Enemy Lines likes to use. They specifically hosted action in the form of an unpermitted rally outside of the Israeli consulate. Again, co-sponsored by Behind Enemy Lines and the Answer Coalition. Others were also involved. And it was this unpermitted rally that deliberately turned violent. I think there were 56 arrests that were made because members of this coalition, Behind Enemy Lines, the Answer Coalition, Students for Justice in Palestine, the Palestinian Youth Movement, they deliberately clashed with Chicago Police Department. That was their intent. That's why you host an event the way that they hosted it, because they wanted clashes with police, because they wanted to be arrested, because they were using violence as a vehicle to push their political ideology. These two groups, Behind Enemy Lines and the Answer Coalition, shared marketing materials. Their flyers were jointly made. The logistics were paid for in a nebulous sort of way. Was it Behind Enemy Lines? Was it Answer Coalition? There's no receipts. There's no way to tell. Same with their calls to action on social media. They have promoted events like this many times before. This is not an isolated incident. It was not a one-time collaboration. And they always have the same ideological nature to their events. No business as usual, end U.S. aid to Israel. They are very similar groups, if not de facto the same group. Now, going back for a second, we're going to talk about the funding for the Answer Coalition because that answers a lot of our questions. We're going to get to that in just a second. But let's go back to that screenshot of that Zoom call for just a moment. And let's zero in, once we're back on that screenshot, there are, I believe, 5 individuals on that screen. We'll wait until this is up. 5 individuals. There's a woman in the top left corner. There is a man in the middle who is wearing, his face is completely covered. His head is completely covered. There's a woman on the right. And then below that, on the bottom left, is Michael Boyt of Behind Enemy Lines, and then another man on the right. For the purposes of this conversation, I want to focus on the man in the middle whose head is covered and whose face is covered. As you can see on the Zoom call, the name that he offered when he entered the Zoom call, you know how Zoom works, you enter your name. The name he offered was Hussein. But in parentheses there, he said what organization he represented. He said he represented Sammy Dune. So this is Hussein from Sammy Dune. Now, who or what is Sammy Dune? What is this group? Why would this individual, even on a private Zoom call, feel the need to cover his face and head? It's not for religious reasons. It's to mask his identity. Why? Well, it's because this organization, Sammy Dune, is designated, at least in Canada, as a terrorist organization because of its ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a radical Islamist terror group in the Middle East. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a U.S. designated terror group, although up to this moment, I don't believe Sammy Dune is in the United States, except in Canada. But this is the type of individual that Michael Boit associates with. Michael Boit, during this particular event, actually encouraged support for the work that this Hussein from Sammy Dune was promoting. This Hussein from Sammy Dune was praising Hamas's October 7th terror attacks for enabling prisoner exchanges, praising the fact that because Hamas had waged this horrific terror attack on Israel, it allowed the Hamas leader to be released by Israel. This is who Michael Boit and Behind Enemy Lines associate with. In addition, again, we're gonna talk about the significance of the collaboration with the Answer Coalition in just a moment, but I want to just walk through the collaboration with the Students for Justice in Palestine and the Palestinian Youth Movement as well, because I promise it all ties together and it's very important. So Behind Enemy Lines frequently collaborates with Students for Justice in Palestine. Now, Students for Justice in Palestine is the group that is the primary organizer for the agitation on college campuses when it comes to the pro-Hamas protests that turn into riots. It's Students for Justice in Palestine that organizes those events. So bad news to begin with, let alone notwithstanding who funds Students for Justice in Palestine. Their ideology is a violent ideology. Just weeks after the assassination of Charlie Kirk, Students for Justice in Palestine currently, as we speak, is running a campaign called, quote unquote, Break the Butchers. For Gaza, we rise. And they're showing these flyers. We can show these on the screen. These are flyers that show red lines over the eyes of college administrators that Students for Justice in Palestine consider to be too pro-Israel. Let me ask you, what's the implication of a flyer like this? What's the implication of a campaign called Break the Butchers that has red lines over the eyes of the individual targeted on that flyer? Is that indicative of a peaceful protest? Is that indicative of a marketplace of ideas? Is that indicative of certainly valid questions that you're allowed to ask the Israeli government about their tactics? No, it's not. That is an explicit call to violence. That is the assassination culture that Charlie Kirk warned us about. Students for Justice in Palestine is the sponsor of Break the Butchers. Students for Justice in Palestine is a frequent collaborator with Michael Boit of Behind Enemy Lines, the group that in 1 hour and 30 minutes is set to stage quote-unquote protests that we know will be riots right here in cities in the United States. And the left has the audacity to tell us on the right that we need to tone down the rhetoric. Back to that march on the DNC in 2024, in August of 2024. It's hard to believe that that was over a year ago, before the presidential election that resulted in Donald Trump becoming president and defeating Kamala Harris. Behind Enemy Lines co-organized the agitation outside of the DNC that resulted in 56 arrests because they deliberately engaged in altercations with Chicago police officers. Not only was Behind Enemy Lines an instigator and Answer Coalition a collaborator, so was Students for Justice in Palestine. This group was present because they all share an ideology and they all work hand in glove, as does the Palestinian Youth Movement. In Chicago in this year, in 2025, the group behind enemy lines and the Palestinian Youth Movement co-hosted an event in Chicago. I mean, this was just a couple days ago on September 19th of 2025. They co-hosted an event focusing on anti-capitalist actions in solidarity with Gaza. They specifically called to escalate for Palestine, which they think is a way that they can get away with calling for violence without getting prosecuted for threatening violence. But you and I know exactly what they mean because we're not stupid. The Palestinian Youth Movement and Behind Enemy Lines used the same flyers. They had the same marketing people. They had the same flyers. They had the same turnout strategies. They worked hand in gloves. And it's not the first. This is one example of many. In June 2024, the Palestinian Youth Movement hosted a rally in Washington, D.C. that featured Behind Enemy Lines leadership. This is a constant collaboration. As I described at the beginning, the constant collaboration between Michael Boyt and his organization Behind Enemy Lines with three organizations, the Answer Coalition, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Palestinian Youth Movement, actually tell you everything you need to know. And that brings us to the funding for these organizations. We know they're not organic. We know it's not grassroots. We watched it happen in Los Angeles just weeks ago. We watched these operatives, these militant, paid, violent protesters espousing terrorist talking points and Marxist ideology. We saw them try to destroy justice and law and our cities, attacking law enforcement officers and private property. And we know that that's not how American citizens who merely want to make their voices heard behave. We know that this is not grassroots, even as the mainstream media gaslights us and the left pretends that it's just people mad about the genocide in Gaza. We know that that's not true because we're smarter than that. And so we traced the organizers of those anti-ICE riots. We traced who organized this? How did this come to be? Who's paying for this? Who are the people behind this and where are they getting the money? And we traced it to Roy Singham. Roy Singham is an American citizen. He's not quite a billionaire, but people always call him a tech billionaire because he sold his tech company for $750 million. And after he sold his tech company, ThoughtWorks, he moved to China. He lives in Shanghai, China right now because the Chinese Communist Party has given him permission to do so because he's a communist. And I, again, don't say this because I'm just describing or inferring his views. He himself has admitted that he's a communist. He actually shares an office in Shanghai with a propaganda firm of the Chinese Communist Party. He's been seen at propaganda conferences in China, writing in a notebook, a red notebook that has a hammer and a sickle on it. He's praised the Chinese communists, and he uses his money to fund violence in the United States. This is without question. This is inarguable. Roy Singham sends his money through a series of shell organizations. Some of them are NGOs. Some of them are just political activism organizations. And his money is disseminated in a very vague, very confusing, very tangled web. And the result is his money funds these types of violent riots that we have seen in the United States. He is an operative of the CCP. He claims he's not paid by the Chinese Communist Party. Well, prove it. You're allowed to invest in China. You're allowed to live in China. Your business operates out of China. You echo Chinese Communist Party talking points. You are actively engaged in what the Chinese Communist Party has described as their primary tactic for taking down America as the world's dominant superpower, which is funding domestic unrest and violence. You are an operative of the CCP and you're using your money because you're an American citizen. And so if the Chinese Communist Party is using you as a patsy, because you're an American citizen, they say, oh, well, you're allowed to spend your money however you want. And this is what Roy Singham does. He gives his money to groups with very vague, very euphemistic names like the Justice and Education Fund. It's a nonprofit. What do you think it's about? What do you think they do? Well, if you see a name like that, you probably don't even think about it because it's such a boring and inane name. Justice and Education Fund, like who cares? The United Community Fund. What do you think they do? Where does their money go? What's their goal? What's their agenda? What's their ideology? Well, again, your eyes would glaze over just seeing the name written somewhere because the United Community Fund, it sounds boring. But this is the point. These are the groups where Roy Singham gives his money. And these groups, the Justice and Education Fund and the United Community Fund and the People's Forum, which we've talked about before, and the Answer Coalition, these are the groups that disseminate Roy Singham's money to the groups that are operational on the ground. Groups like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which were the primary organizers of the anti-ICE riots, or groups like Students for Justice in Palestine, which are directly funded by Roy Singham-funded groups, or the Palestinian Youth Movement, which is another group directly funded by Roy Singham-funded groups. So you see these three groups, the Answer Coalition, Students for Justice in Palestine, and the Palestinian Youth Movement, all directly funded by this tangled web of euphemistically named nonprofits that are just pass-throughs for Roy Singham's money. And then you see these groups constantly collaborating with Michael Boyt and his group Behind Enemy Lines for marketing and flyers and education and co-hosting events, sponsoring events, appearing on stage at events. And Behind Enemy Lines, of course, is a group without a business structure. So they don't have any reporting about where they get their money, but they have to be getting money somewhere. You can't print flyers without paying for it. You can't organize and host an event without paying for the venue and anything that you need to, even your audio equipment, all these things. Again, that event planners know that all these details that as attendees, we never think about when it comes to events. It costs money to mobilize people and to host events. Where do you think Behind Enemy Lines is getting their money? Do you think it's because of their cozy association, their constant collaboration with groups like the Answer Coalition and Students for Justice in Palestine and the Palestinian Youth Movement, whose ideology and mission, stated mission and goals are almost word for word identical to Behind Enemy Lines? Do you think that their constant collaboration could be indicative of the fact that they are de facto supported by the same money that Roy Singham is sending from his cozy Chinese communist nest through these nonprofits to groups that are specifically agitating and committing violence here in the United States, in our cities? Well, the answer to that is duh. Obviously. Of course it's connected. Nothing could possibly be as common sense as connecting those dots. And it can be stopped. This is not something that we have to act like, oh, look at us. We solved the mystery. We're super sleuths and pat us on the back. No. This is step one. Step one is simply saying, hey, look, everyone can understand exactly how the left structures their violence financially and organizationally. And once we understand how it's structured and we've traced it back to its origin, both the founders of the individual groups themselves, but also the true origin, Roy Singham and the Chinese Communist Party, Congress can stop this. The Trump administration can stop this. And they not only can, they should. They must stop this. Because in T-minus 1 hour and 23 minutes, left-wing violence is scheduled to be unleashed in our cities again. Behind Enemy Lines at 4 p.m. Eastern is planning and plotting to take over some of the biggest cities in our country: New York City, Chicago, North Carolina. And what do you think they're going to do? Based on their stated ideological beliefs, their history of quote-unquote disruption, which is just a stupid euphemism for violence, based on the fact that the founder, Michael Boyt, said we want these people to know no peace, based on their praise of terrorism and terrorists, what do you think is going to happen in less than an hour and a half? We've seen this time and time again. We've seen it and we've experienced it. We've suffered it. And it doesn't have to be this way. And there are things, the hopeful part is there are things we can do to stop this. Send this to your member of Congress immediately. Because wouldn't it be great if for once, we actually stopped this violence before it happened? that we didn't take 3 months or 6 months or a year to conduct a postmortem on who actually was behind the Black Lives Matter violence, who exactly funds Antifa, where did these anti-ICE riots come from? We can stop this before it happens. We still have almost an hour and a half. Send it to your member of Congress and share this far and wide. By the way, those who are in leadership roles in these violent organizations understand that they have been exposed. They understand that their time conducting violence in the United States in the way that they've been able to get away with for years now is coming to an end thanks to the Trump administration. Wait until you hear what a leader of Antifa has done after President Trump designated Antifa a terror group. This coward fled the country. We're going to talk about him in just a second, but first I want to thank Crowd Health, a sponsor for today's episode. This time of year, insurance companies, health insurance companies are hoping you'll sleepwalk into another cycle of overpriced premiums, network headaches, and endless fine print. Ugh, I hate just even thinking about health insurance. That's why my husband and I quit our health insurance last year and joined Crowd Health. It's open enrollment season right now where these insurance companies are betting that you won't question anything, but you should. It's who we are on the Liz Wheeler Show. Question everything because there's finally a better way. Crowd Health is not insurance. I call it assurance. It's a community of people who have had enough of the old system and are taking healthcare into their own hands. For under $100 a month, you get access to prescription discounts, lab testing tools, a network of quality doctors, and a team that negotiates medical bills on your behalf. And if something major happens, because it does in all of our lives at some point, well, you pay the first $500 and then the crowd, that's me and my husband and others, step in and actually help you pay the rest. It's what healthcare used to feel like before it got hijacked by bureaucracy and bad policy, before Obamacare ruined it for everyone. Crowd Health members have already saved over $40 million simply by refusing to overpay. You can too. This open enrollment season, take your power back. Join Crowd Health to get started today for $99. Go to joincrowdhealth.com. Use my promo code Liz. That's joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. The mandatory disclaimer is that Crowd Health is not insurance. I call it assurance because it covers you when you need it. Opt out. Take your power back. This is how we win. Joincrowdhealth.com, promo code Liz. All right. So those who are in leadership positions of the violent left, and it's the reason that I'm kind of chuckling as I say this is because the left is very famous, and the left includes the mainstream media, Democrat politicians, and leftist activists, and people on leftists on X. They're very famous for saying that Antifa is not an organization. You can't designate them a terror organization because they are a decentralized networks of grassroots chapters, blah, 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 blah. We exposed the truth of, or the lie behind that. We exposed the truth. If you haven't watched that episode, highly recommend you go back to last week and watch who is behind Antifa. You'll see that narrative that's widely disseminated among the left, just debunked in took me about 20 minutes to debunk this. But it's funny because obviously there's leadership, even in Antifa. There are thought leaders, there are mobilization leaders, there are leaders of violent groups. But one such leader is a man named Mark Bray. Mark Bray is the author of a book called The Anti-Fascist Handbook. We can show this on the screen here. You've probably seen the cover of this book before. It went quite viral when it was written. The contents of this book are entirely disturbing. They show exactly what, you can see that on the screen. It's got communism. I mean, you can tell it's communism just by looking at it. Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. Well, this Anti-Fascist Handbook is a core part of the training material for violent left-wingers, especially Antifa members. And the author, Mark Bray, has fled the country. He left the United States, which on one hand, you want to just say, okay, see ya. I hope you don't come back. On the other hand, this man is an absolute coward because he understands the reality that he's facing. He understands that he has, in fact, played a significant role in fomenting and organizing violence on behalf of Antifa, and that's left-wing terrorism. And now, finally, the Trump administration is going to be holding these crooks, these criminals, these terrorists accountable for it. And so he fled the country. He claimed that his life was at risk. He said, since the right wing is constantly threatening me, we have had to relocate my family to Europe for a year. There are rumors that he's in Spain. which is the most ridiculous, absurd thing that you've ever heard, because the right, obviously, I mean, you saw how the right behaved in the wake of the assassination of Charlie Kirk when one of our own was murdered for what we all believe. There weren't riots. There wasn't violence. There was no retaliatory killing. There were prayer vigils and memorials and calls for unity and a spiritual revival. That's how the right reacts. We're not the left. We're not Black Lives Matter. We don't break windows and loot luxury purses and burn the businesses of Black business owners because we are mad that Black Lives Matter brainwashed us into thinking that police are committing brutality against Black people because Black people have black skin. We're the right. We're not violence. It's the left that's violent. And that has been proven. So when Mark Bray says, well, he was forced to leave the country because right-wingers were threatening, what a bunch of BS. What an absolute bunch of BS. The fact of the matter is Mark Bray fled the country because he's a coward, and he wrote a terrorist handbook that has inspired and trained left-wingers committing violence across the country, and he's afraid he's going to be held accountable under the law, which he should be. And he left the country. Goodbye, Mark. Goodbye. Europe is a fool to take you. Well, we are glad to be rid of you. Now, there was a lot of chatter online last night about President Trump potentially pardoning Jeffrey Epstein's madam, Ghislaine Maxwell, who is currently serving prison time for sex trafficking underage girls to Jeffrey Epstein. And I had a comment I wanted to make about this story because I watched the video. President Trump was asked by CNN's Caitlin Collins whether he intended to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell because Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal to the Supreme Court declined to hear her appeal. And so her only recourse at this point would be to ask President Trump for a pardon. CNN asked President Trump while he was in the Oval Office whether he planned to pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. And this is his response. And I'm going to tell you what I make of this. So go ahead and play this video.
Today, Mr. President,
Say it.
The Supreme Court is back and said that they rejected today an appeal by Ghislaine Maxwell to overturn her conviction. That means her only chance of getting out of prison is a pardon from you. Is that something you're...
Who are we talking about?
Ghislaine Maxwell.
You know, I haven't heard the name in so long. I can say this, that I'd have to take a look at it. I would have to take a look. Did they reject that?
She wanted to appeal her conviction.
And what happened?
They said that they were not going to hear her appeal.
I see. Well, I'll take a look at it. I will speak to the DOJ. I wouldn't consider it or not consider it. I don't know anything about it. So, but I will speak to the DOJ.
Why would she be a candidate for clemency, sir?
I don't know. I mean, I'd have to speak to the DOJ. I'll look at it. I have a lot of people have asked me for pardons. I call him Puff Daddy has asked me for a pardon.
But she was convicted of child sex trafficking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have to take a look at it. I'd have to ask DOJ. I didn't know they rejected it. I didn't know she was even asking for it, frankly.
Okay, so this video created some backlash because, you know, Caitlin Collins was obviously trying to set President Trump up by asking whether he would pardon Ghislaine Maxwell because she wanted to be outraged by the idea that Trump would pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. And I want to be perfectly upfront. I don't think President Trump should pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. I don't think he will pardon Ghislaine Maxwell, but I think it was not a question that was asked in good faith by CNN. It was an attempt to trick Trump into appearing to go soft on Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein. So CNN, as always, can be completely discounted. The beginning of the video, President Trump didn't seem to know who Caitlin Collins was talking about not because he's unfamiliar with Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, everyone knows that name, but because this is a massive press gaggle in the Oval Office and Caitlin Collins spoke very quickly. I don't think President Trump heard the name Ghislaine Maxwell at first. That's why he said, wait, who are you talking about? Then when Caitlin Collins said Ghislaine Maxwell, he says, oh, I haven't heard that name in a long time. That's a comment that you make when you actually didn't fully comprehend or you couldn't place who the other person is talking about. And I just want to say, and this is not a scandalous take. This is not salacious. This is actually me just sort of dismissing this, even though I strongly believe that President Trump should not, and I don't think he will, pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. President Trump said nothing wrong in this response. President Trump said nothing bad or unreasonable or anything scandalous whatsoever in this response. He literally just gave a very I don't want to say prepared answer, but he gave a very deferential question that, like, oh, I get a lot of pardon requests. Very boilerplate is the word that I'm looking for. He says, I get a lot of pardon requests. I always consult with the DOJ about it. I don't know the details of what happened at the Supreme Court or her appeal or what she's asking me for a pardon for. And he just said he was going to talk to the Department of Justice. This is such a general response. It could apply to literally any pardon request that a president gets. And this is, I'm sorry to say, you know that I have had my differences with, specifically the Attorney General on how the Trump administration has handled all of the Jeffrey Epstein stuff. But in this case, President Trump, this is not dramatic. This is nothing. It's truly a nothing burger. What President Trump said was not wrong or bad or unreasonable. It was just boilerplate. It was general. It's a non-controversy. And like I said, I don't even think President Trump knew who Caitlin Collins or heard what she said at the very beginning. And once he did, he was like, oh, well, I'm just gonna, talk to the Department of Justice about the details because I know nothing about what you are asking. How is that dramatic whatsoever? It is not. Like I said, I don't think President Trump should pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. She was convicted, and in my opinion, rightfully so, for sex trafficking underage girls to Jeffrey Epstein, and allegedly committed acts that are nearly as egregious as what Jeffrey Epstein did himself. Because of that, she should remain in prison. She is not a good person. She is a danger to society, and she deserves that prison sentence. I don't think President Trump should pardon her, no matter whether she was willing to sit down with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche and cooperate with that interview or not. She already seemingly got a cushier position, and she was transferred to a cushier prison as a result of that cooperation. I certainly don't think that she should be let off easy when it comes to justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And like I said, I don't think that President Trump is going to pardon her. Again, totally boilerplate answer, super, super general, non-controversy, nothing burger. That is my take on it. Thank you for all the questions that I've gotten in the last 24 hours regarding President Trump and Ghislaine Maxwell. All right, guys. If you have not subscribed to the show, please do so. Go to Spotify, search The Liz Wheeler Show, hit subscribe, leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the show. Make sure you share today's episode. I mean, honestly, if you have to choose one action, either subscribing or sharing today's episode, share today's episode on Instagram, on X, on Facebook, in your family group chats, to all your friends. Share this episode. We do not have to tolerate living in a country where left-wing terrorism and violence is the norm, especially when it's not grassroots, it's organized, it's funded by a left-wing communist billionaire. We know exactly where the money's coming from, at the behest of the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't have to be this way. The people in the positions of power in our country, whether it's in the Department of Justice, whether it's in Congress, whether it's in the White House, they can take action to stop this. And it's up to you to raise your voice and tell them to do so now. So share this episode. Thank you for watching today. Thank you for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.